Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Australia's Jewish community, and all of Australia, in fact, is reeling from what was nothing less than a massacre, and it took place at one of the most beautiful places on earth, Bondi Beach, outside the city of Sydney. Very quickly, from the earliest news reports, it was clear that the shooting was a terror incident and that its goal was to kill Jews who had gathered to celebrate Hanukkah.
An attack on the Jewish community, one that the authorities have now labeled a terrorist incident, a terror attack on the Jewish community here in Bondi, which is it's a very strong Jewish community here in Bondi, a very strong, very proud Jewish community. Right up the street from here, there are several synagogues, and behind me in the park where people were attacked was a Hanukkah festival going on here, the first night of Hanukkah around the world being celebrated by Jewish people. There was an event here called Hanukkah by the Sea, and that was what was targeted by these two men with guns.
As we record, at least 15 people are dead, 38 more hospitalized in the attack from a father and son, both armed with assault rifles. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese wasted no time in denouncing the attack in the strongest of terms and calling for unity and support for the Jewish community.
There is no place for this hate, violence and terrorism in our nation. Let me be clear, we will eradicate it. Amidst this vile act of violence and hate will emerge a moment of national unity, where Australians across the board will embrace their fellow Australians of Jewish faith at this dark moment for our nation.
Despite his words, there is much frustration and even fury among Australian Jews who say the writing was on the wall as anti-Semitic violence soared in their country since October 7th and that the government has failed to counteract it. The response from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was a big "I told you so." This is what he said publicly in the aftermath of the attack, citing a letter that he sent to Albanese in August, warning him that the Australian government was, quote, promoting and encouraging anti-Semitism.
Your call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It rewards Hamas terrorism. It emboldens those who menace Australian Jews and encourages the Jew hatred now stalking your streets. Anti-Semitism is a cancer. It spreads when leaders stay silent. It retreats when leaders act. I call upon you to replace weakness with action, appeasement with resolve. Instead, Prime Minister, you replaced weakness with weakness and appeasement with more appeasement. Your government did nothing to stop the spread of anti-Semitism in Australia. You did nothing to curb the cancer cells that were growing inside your country. You took no action. You let the disease spread. And the result is the horrific attacks on Jews we saw today.
Joining me on the podcast from Sydney to describe the grief and anger consuming the Sydney and wider Australian Jewish community and what they are demanding going forward is Lynda Ben-Menashe, president of the National Council of Jewish Women and a longtime community leader. After that, Haaretz senior defense correspondent Amos Harel joins me to talk about messages delivered by Israeli intelligence to the Australian government in recent months, warning that something like this incident was likely to take place and what they believe lies ahead. Those conversations coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, editor-in-chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Lynda Ben-Menashe, President of the National Council of Jewish Women Australia. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alison.
Lynda, what is the mood of the community in Sydney right now? How are people feeling? How are you feeling? And talk about the earliest news of the attack until now, just about a day later, to describe how the community is absorbing the experience.
Well, I think it's 24 hours now, and most Jewish Australians have gone through a gamut of emotions: numbness, absolute shock but not surprise, despair, devastation, and just a feeling of inevitability, which is a terrible thing to say, but we, had watched Jews gunned down on the streets of Washington, D.C. and London and Paris and other cities, and we knew that it was just a matter of time until it happened in Australia, and it's just horrific. And we, I guess, feel very different tonight than we did last night. Tonight, some of us can kind of walk without shaking, but last night we were all very, very, very shaky. And I will say that there's an awful lot of anger too.
Tell me about the anger.
Well, the anger comes when we have experienced a period of over 2 years since October 7, where we saw my city, Sydney, desecrated 3 times, actually. So there was the unbelievable impact of October 7. And 2 days later, on the steps of our Sydney Opera House, our beloved building, Israeli flags were burned and people were screaming death to the Jews and where are the Jews and maybe gas the Jews. And we Jews were told that we had to stay home because it was too dangerous for us. And all of this was in reaction to the state government projecting onto the sails of our beautiful opera house the colours of blue and white in solidarity with Jewish people everywhere after the October 7 attack. And it was a horrific experience for us to witness, but also the fact that there was absolutely no consequence to this behaviour in our city. That was an absolute turning point for us in our feeling of safety as Australians. And then this year in August, you probably saw there was a march over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, yet another Australian icon. And it was named a March for Humanity, but what it really was a march against Israel and against Zionism. And there were flags of various terrorist organisations, including ISIS, and there was a massive portrait right at the front of the march under which a whole lot of politicians and important people stood of the Ayatollah, that great bastion of human rights. And again, there was no retribution, there was no consequence to this. And now we see the exact result of the foment of this hatred and of the lack of consequences. We see this exact result play out that we have begged our governments to prevent. We kept saying, with our history, with our understanding of where hate speech leads, where our understanding of the vilification of a community, the demonization of a people leads, please use the laws that we have in place to stop the hate speech on our streets and this vilification. And it wasn't done, and we knew it would lead here, and it did. And so the anger is palpable.
What do you think they could have done that would have, I'm not saying prevented this incident, but, made it less likely that this incident would occur? I would imagine that there is the aspect that you speak about. There's the incitement and there's the lack of consequences to this kind of violent speech on the streets. But also, do you feel that the government has sufficiently helped the Jewish community physically protect itself? And from what you see, did it do enough in terms of intelligence and taking these threats seriously in order to use law enforcement enforcement to try to make sure that people who are clearly dangers of anti-Semitic acts don't have access to automatic weapons.
So there isn't access to automatic weapons in this country. There was a massacre, a mass shooting, I think it was 1996 in Port Arthur in Tasmania, and a Conservative government did something very dramatic and banned automatic weapons in this country after that massacre. And so, unlike the United States and other countries, we don't have regular school shootings or mass shootings. We are hoping, of course, that, this tragic event will promote a similarly dramatic action. What that should be is one of many, many things. And so the many, many things are actually outlined in a report, a set of recommendations that were presented to the government, the federal government, in July this year by the anti-Semitism envoy, who had been appointed by the federal government. And those recommendations have not been implemented. Here and there a little something, but it's been lip service, it's been waiting, it's been let's wait until the Islamophobia envoy's report is delivered, let's wait until the Human Rights Commission's report is delivered, and let's see. And there's been all this prevarication, and so there's tremendous anger about that as well. It's a whole of government response that's required. Yes, indeed, as you say, there is excellent policing here. There is excellent intelligence here. There's a lot of intelligence cooperation with Israeli authorities and so on. And there is a tremendous amount of funding from federal and state governments for physical security of the Jewish community. Our children go to school and have for the past decades behind high walls and armed guards. Our synagogues have armed guards outside, and they have, of course, a full volunteer unarmed Jewish security service as well. So physical security is not actually the issue. And since October 7, there have been millions and millions of dollars poured into more physical security. It's more the rest of response. There is, it's the Gillian Siegel is the anti-Semitism envoy. In the Gillian Siegel report, there is a great focus on education. And yes, we know, and so many people speak about how more Holocaust education and more education about anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily prevent anti-Semitism. And in some cases, it gives people some ideas. But there are many, many different forms of education that are also recommended in the report, including more information and more education about disinformation, about propaganda, skills development for young people and old people, about how you actually recognize lies and libels. I mean, there is also legislation around the world in countries like Estonia and I think Lithuania who have faced the influx of Russian propaganda and disinformation for, decades since the end of the Second World War. And they have a whole of government response where it's not censorship, it's the media and the education systems and the government and everybody kind of works together to help citizens understand how to recognize and how to deconstruct disinformation. And so there's that piece of it. And there's, the actual building of social cohesion. There's all this talk about social cohesion and multiculturalism and all this sort of thing. And it's all very abstract and it's all very lovely. And it's just words, because there is no social cohesion without the notion of a social contract. There is no social cohesion without the notion of a national project that all citizens are part of and working towards, which is shared, where they get to know each other as people who are building something together. Then you don't have a nation. And so we have this broken down version of multiculturalism, which is, the old mosaic, really, and identity politics have fed into further and further polarization between groups. And instead of the idea of Australian civics and citizenship, we have empty slogans. And so our government needs to stop talking about what a brilliant example we are of multiculturalism in the world and wake up to the fact that we are absolutely not.
Lynda, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in his remarks after the attack, drew a direct line between Australia's support for a Palestinian state in the United Nations and their failure to effectively combat anti-Semitism, sort of making it part and parcel of the same thing. Is there a discussion or a debate in Australia in the aftermath of this, but even before, about how do you separate legitimate criticism and legitimate policy differences with the current Israeli government and the kind of sort of toxic hatred, anti-Semitism, and violence that we see today? How is that parsed out locally?
Well, I would say that in the last 24 hours, there has not been a discussion of that, but there certainly has been in the years preceding. And we are in Australia I think it is fair to say, a very quote unquote Zionist community. In the most recent surveys, something like almost 90% of Australian Jews say that they would identify as Zionist. So many of us visit there, have lived there, have family there, etc., much more so than in other Anglo countries like the United States, etc. And at the same time, it is not uncritical Zionism. I was at a dinner maybe 2.5 weeks ago where the leadership in my state, the Jewish leadership in my state, and I'm talking about people who sit on the World Jewish Congress, I'm talking about, the heads of our Executive Council of Australian Jewry, our peak body, I'm the head of the peak women's body, and many others like that, Zionist Federation itself. We were talking about, indeed, this issue of how do we continue to criticize policies of the Israeli government without criticizing the existence or denying the existence of a Jewish state and its legitimacy.
Do you feel that outside the Jewish community that line has been blurred?
Outside our community, that line has been blurred. I will say that the organized Jewish community is not afraid in this country of criticizing the government of Israel. For example, when the nation-state law came out, both, I think, the Zionist Federation and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry criticized it publicly. Most recently, there has been criticism from our peak bodies also of the racist demeanor and speech of members of Netanyahu's government, of settler violence, and all sorts of other elements of the current administration which do not align with our vision of Zionism in its liberal sense. Outside the Jewish community, indeed, the line, as it has all over the world, between legitimate criticism of Israel and its government and demonization, delegitimization and double standards has been blurred for many, many years. We certainly used to talk about the folly of conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, but in Australia, as in probably every country in the world now, anti-Zionism seems to have been the chrysalis from which rank, vile anti-Semitism has emerged. There has been permission in the public space, in academia, in media in particular, to conflate the two and to express lies, libels, anti-Semitic stereotypes, and all kinds of vile racism about Jews / Zionists / Israel. We had, state parliamentarian here a few months ago talking about the tentacles of the Jewish lobby. We have had the most foul experience from government and from people at both ends of the political spectrum who permitted to be anti-Semites publicly. And I think our community is completely aware that there's anti-Semitism on the right, there's anti-Semitism on the left, and there's anti-Semitism from the Islamists, and all of those have coalesced to be pretty much a petri dish for the massacre that happened 24 hours ago.
Australia, and particularly places like Bondi Beach, have always been sort of idealistically viewed as safe havens from anti-Semitism, a place where European Jews and even Israeli Jews move to escape it. A huge percentage of your community are Holocaust survivors, descendants of Holocaust survivors. After this has happened, do you have any hope, vision that things can go back, or that the clock can be turned back to the way it is? Do you think that this incident will be some sort of turning point and that things might change from now?
Well, this is absolutely a turning point. I don't think we can ever go back. I mean, let's talk about, the United States trying to make America great again. Are we going to make Australia great again? I don't know. I wish it was greater than it is now. I wish it was the Australia that I grew up in, where we did have that sense of being safe here. We did have that sense that, our Jewish identity was not at odds with an Australian identity, and that there was respect between groups. And again, going back to that notion of a national project. But I think we can move forward. And I think the fact that all of these pivotal moments, Opera House, Sydney Harbour Bridge, Bondi Beach, happened at iconic locations in Australia, have made Australians very aware of the attacks on the Jewish community really being attacks on Australian lifestyle and on Australian lives. And Australians hate unfairness. They actually do have a national ethos of stuff that doesn't feel good to them, doesn't feel right. And what we've seen on TV in the last 24 hours is, Australians of all shapes and colours and sizes and backgrounds saying how disgusting this is and how un-Australian this is, and just a real shock. And I think there were a lot of people who kind of thought we Jews were exaggerating a bit when we talked about feeling unsafe, and, that notion of cultural safety, and it didn't really speak much to people. And we kept saying this sense of cultural safety, this sense of exclusion, and it didn't really sink in until 24 hours ago. And it was translated into something that everybody actually understands, everybody of every age understands. And now I reckon they get that we were not exaggerating and that we are the canary in the mine. And to be honest, we, like all communities, we do polling of, how do people see us? How do quote unquote average Australians see the Jewish community? They love us. They love the fact that we came to this country with nothing in a suitcase, as you say, many of us after the Holocaust, and we built and we contributed. And we're philanthropists, and we're business owners, and we're academics, and we're contributors to the country. And we don't cause trouble. And to see us attacked is pretty shocking to many Australians. Our Prime Minister said 24 hours ago that he was distressed and shocked. Well, the Jewish community has been distressed for the past 2 years at the lack of action from the government, and also at the growing unsafety that we have felt. But we weren't shocked that this happened. It was inevitable. But the Australian Prime Minister is a decent guy and a nice guy, and like most Australians, he was shocked that this kind of thing could happen.
Lynda Ben-Menashe, I hope that your predictions or that your hopes come true, and that this is a turning point to improving the situation of Australian Jews as they mourn and they heal from this terrible experience. Again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, Amos Harel on the shooters and on the Israeli intelligence warnings that preceded the attack. Amos Harel, Senior Defense Analyst for Haaretz. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Alison.
Normally you're here, we're talking about Gaza, we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about the White House and Donald Trump, but today it's all about Australia. Your current analysis in Haaretz is headlined, "After the deadly attack at Bondi Beach, Israel warns Sydney won't be the last target." Can you tell us about what you call the numerous intelligence warnings from Israel to the Australian government, and what you said are these two trends in Australia that have created the growing danger, in both of which you referred to Iran?
Well, it's actually connected to what's happened in Gaza, because Gaza serves as an excuse. We saw that at the immediate response around the world in major Western cities and campuses of universities and so on, with anti-Israeli sentiments and demonstrations immediately after the massacre at the Gaza envelope communities. And since then, we've seen a rise of anti-Semite and anti-Israeli incidents in many places in the West, but Australia was even more significant than some of them. Apparently, both Mossad and Shin Bet have followed that rather closely and saw these two trends. First, pro-Palestinian attacks, some by leftist and sometimes right-wing Australian activists. In some cases, these were Muslim immigrants behind this. And it's assumed that to some extent, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are also involved. Apparently, the father and son who were behind the attack yesterday were affiliated in some way to ISIS. Then there's the Iranian involvement. Iran has been exposed as the force behind a couple of attempts to attack Israeli and Jewish sites I think in Melbourne. And as a reaction to that, the Australian government decided to deport the Iranian ambassador and also announced that the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, would be defined as a terrorist organization. So this was Israeli information behind this that led to Australian decisions. And yet, in spite of those warnings, what we saw was the Australian government not acting aggressively enough against those trends. And in some way, this is also connected to the reaction on the ground. We can see the videos, we can watch them quite carefully and see how slowly the Australian police and security detail there had reacted to the danger. I'm not sure if there's an immediate explanation that connects everything, but I think the sentiment at large was that this wasn't a clear and present danger. I think things would probably change after the events yesterday and after their horrific results.
You wrote, and this was kind of reflected in Netanyahu's remarks after the attack, that the impression by these Israeli security officials was that Australia's security and precautionary measures were limited, and they had a theory as to why.
Well, I assume it has to do with Australian politics. I don't know enough about that, but it probably is a combination of not wanting to offend a growing Muslim community. I think it's close to a million people by now. This is a massive political force, and at least the center-left parties probably would prefer not to confront this community directly. And of course, most of the people in this community are not involved in any kind of way in attacks against Israelis or Jews. Then there's always the discussion about freedom of speech. What consists of an actual threat and what is just the freedom for people in the West to express their feelings. You can be against Israeli actions in Gaza, and you can talk in quite critical terms of Israeli behavior during the war on the one hand, but when it comes to calls for globalizing the Intifada or chants like from the river to the sea, we all know what this means. Now, of course, Netanyahu right now is using this for domestic reasons as well. It's a good diversion from other events happening, but you could not resist mentioning the paradox yesterday between the fact that the Israeli ministers were so quick to blame the Australian government for its failures and its responsibility to what has happened in Sydney, while they're insisting that Netanyahu has no blame whatsoever for what happened at the Gaza envelope 2 years ago.
Yeah, that is an interesting paradox. He threw in also in his remarks the support of the Australian government for the creation of a Palestinian state in the United Nations.
That's nonsense. Look, it doesn't. It's not connected in any way, in my view. In the end, it was Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority who was behind the massacre on October 7th. And there's a pro two-state solution sentiment all over the West. It doesn't mean that this encourages specific ISIS-affiliated terrorists in Sydney to go on a rampage and try to kill Jews while they're celebrating Hanukkah. I don't think this is connected in any way.
Amos Harel our defense senior analyst. Your purview now seems to be spreading all over the globe. You're having to write not only about what's going on in our region, but as far-flung locations as Australia. So thank you for doing it for us at Haaretz, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Alison.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guests, Lynda Ben-Menashe and Amos Harel, and to producer and editor Nara Malkin. If you want to continue to listen to the podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're inclined, leave us a 5-star rating there, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Sommer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.